So as that indicates, my usual research is not at all on alcohol. It's actually on opiates and cocaine in the American Philippines. So today is actually more of a side project, really, that I've been looking at in the context of my PhD research. So if Jim asks, I've been writing the last chapter of my dissertation the whole time. So this is quite a new line of inquiry for me, actually. So if y'all have any particular feedback or recommendations on it, I'd be really happy to hear it. So essentially, this is just looking at the regulation of alcohol in the Philippines during the American colonial era and how the Philippines ended up being exempt from the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act, more specifically in the United States during the era of Prohibition there. And so the general era of the American colonial rule in the Philippines was characterized by the increasing restriction of psychoactive substances, including the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 and the 18th Amendment and subsequent Volstead Act of 1919. As a United States territory, the legal status of the Philippines in terms of this legislation proved to be noteworthy in two particular ways. The Philippine prohibition of the sale and consumption of opiates except for medicinal purposes in 1905 was the first state or territory-wide legislation of its kind. The law was amended to include cocaine in 1907 and took effect in 1908, eventually leading to the Harrison Narcotics Act in the US. However, due to an unlikely confluence of factors, the prohibitory zeal of the early 20th century did not apply to the Philippines in the case of alcohol. The Philippines were ultimately one of only two US territories, along with the US Virgin Islands, to be exempt from the Volstead Act, illustrating a little-known example of the agency of the colonial Philippines. Long before the American occupation of the Philippines, there was a well-established culture of alcohol production and consumption there. Maggie Brady and Vic McGrath's work on the spread of tuba in Southeast Asia looks at the role of alcohol in Filipino culture and the spread of the knowledge of tuba production from the Philippines to neighboring cultures. Brady and McGrath describe the spread of the technical knowledge of tuba fermentation and distillation as an example of relocation diffusion. So when individuals move from one place to another, in this case from one country to another, exporting a particular habit or trait to the new location. So this is something that was not unique to the Philippines, but within the broader regional culture. Tuba is made from the sap of various species of palm trees, particularly the nipa palm, and referred to elsewhere in Asia as toddy, from the Filipino language Tagalog, meaning fermented coconut milk. Following fermentation, tuba can then be distilled into lembanog, known elsewhere as arak. Lembanog was referred to as vino de coco or vino de nipa, so coconut wine or nipa wine by the Spanish, and generally referred to simply as vino or wine by the time of the United States conquest. The migration of Filipino laborers facilitated the spread of tuba and lembanog from the Philippines to the Torres Strait and as far afield as Mexico. Moreover, economic expansion in the late Spanish colonial era during the second half of the 19th century created a market for imports of foreign-made alcohols, such as whiskey and port. So similarly to the consumption of opium, American colonial regulations encountered a well-established cultural practice that long predated American arrival. However, the most significant piece of legislation to affect the legal status of prohibition in the Philippines was generally unrelated to the regulation of alcohol. The Democratic victory of Woodrow Wilson in 1912 facilitated the passage of an act to declare the purpose of the people of the United States as to the future political status of the people of the Philippine Islands and to provide a more autonomous government for the islands in 1916, popularly known as the Jones Act. Section 6 of the Jones Act essentially established the legal autonomy of the Philippines, stating that statutory laws of the United States hereafter enacted shall not apply to the Philippine Islands, except when specifically so provided. So here you have a poster that was in the Philippines at the time of its promulgation. So the glorious Jones Act, Washington, 29th August, 1916. At 10:30 this morning, President Wilson has signed the Jones Act. It is worth stating that the Democratic support for expanding the autonomy of the Philippines as part of gradual preparation for independence, as they put it, was due in large part to perceptions of the colony as unremunerative, rather than an ideological commitment to Filipino self-determination. Democrat support for expanding Philippine autonomy also included further incorporating Filipinos into government and civil service positions there, a process referred to as Filipinization. Wilson appointee Governor General Francis Harrison was a significant advocate for Filipinization over the opposition of more conservative colonial officials. Commissioner of Public Health Dr. Victor Heiser claimed bitterly in his autobiography that many Filipinos were lifted into positions which they were not qualified to fill, in his words, as a result of Harrison's belief that the only way for people to learn to govern was to let them do the governing as they wished. Harrison's belief in the importance of Filipino self-government would later extend to decisions regarding the enforcement of prohibition in the islands. Although it was not the primary purpose of the Jones Act, congressional hearings over its passage had included discussion of the nature of alcohol consumption in the Philippines. At the hearings before the U.S. Senate Committee on the Philippines in December 1914, committee chairman inquired regarding the prevalence of inebriation in Filipino society, to which Vice Governor Henderson Martin replied, "They are not much inclined to drink. I have never seen Filipinos drink to any extent." Former Philippine Secretary of the Interior, Dean Worcester, corroborated this in greater detail, testifying that they, meaning the Filipinos, are extremely temperate in their use of alcoholic stimulants. Drunkenness is by no means unknown, but it is far from common. The hearing also addressed the possibility of prohibition in the Philippines, which Worcester regarded as difficult to enforce and unnecessary in light of the social norms of moderate alcohol consumption. However, he differentiated the so-called hill people, referring to indigenous ethnic linguistic groups like the Igorots of northern Luzon, from the general population in this regard, claiming that, in his words, they will get drunk as often as they can and as thoroughly as they can. As a result, Worcester noted that the colonial government of the Philippines had passed legislation making it illegal to sell, trade, or give the so-called white man's liquor to the groups considered hill people. So an example of the paternalistic attitudes that Jamie and Deborah excellently explained earlier. As the Jones Act hearings demonstrate, perceived cultural practices of inhabitants of the Philippines regarding alcohol consumption played a clear role in influencing US legislative dispositions toward colonial alcohol regulation. 3 years after the passage of the Jones Act, the 18th Amendment was ratified by the required number of states on January 16, 1919. Consequently, following 1 year from the ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within, the importation thereof into, or the exportation thereof from the United States, and all territory subject to its jurisdiction, for beverage purposes, is hereby prohibited. Following the amendment's ratification, the Volstead Act implementing prohibition was passed in Congress on July 22nd. However, the Volstead Act and subsequent amendments did not specifically include the Philippines, rendering it inapplicable there under Section 6 of the Jones Act. It is unclear from available sources whether this was initially an oversight or an intentional omission. During proceedings for H.R. 7294 to amend the Volstead Act, an amendment was proposed to specify that the act applied to the Hawaiian Islands specifically at this time of territory, despite the fact that prohibition was already being enforced there. So you can see here, there's a cartoon in the Hawaiian Gazette. So from very early after the annexation of Hawaii, you have reform temperance advocates who are there attempting to enforce prohibition as well. So you've got this great little cartoon of a representative of the Anti-Saloon League, essentially waterboarding the Honolulu brewery here. So in the course of debate over this proposal, Representative James Mann argued that it was unnecessary to amend the Volstead Act to clarify this, as the 18th Amendment already applied to all territory subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, and consequently, so did the Volstead Act. Andrew Volstead then interjected that the 18th Amendment did apply to all US territory, but that the Volstead Act did not. He then reiterated over Mann's objection that the original act, meaning the Volstead Act, does not apply to the Philippines for the reason that there is an express provision in that statute, referring to the Jones Act, to the effect that no law shall apply to the Philippine Islands unless it is expressly so provided. He also cited an Attorney General ruling confirming this. However, He did not specify why the Volstead Act had not initially included provisions applying it to the Philippines or subsequently added amendments to that effect. Regardless, the Act's lack of reference to the Philippines makes it clear that regulation of alcohol there was not a significant concern to legislators in the metropole. But if anyone has any advice or suggestions as to why that's the case, I would be very happy to hear them, as I haven't managed to figure out exactly why that was the case. The exemption of the Philippines from prohibition did not go unopposed, however. In May 1921, former Representative Charles H. Randall testified before the House Committee on the Judiciary, censuring the colony's omission from legislation and seeking the inclusion of the Philippines under the Volstead Act. Randall summarized his complaint as follows. The people of the Philippine Islands, immediately after the Volstead Act went into effect, applied to the Governor General of the islands for assistance in having the law enforced there. Governor General Harrison, probably being in doubt as to whether the constitutional amendment extended to that territory, submitted the matter not to the Attorney General of the US, who is a superior officer, as I take it, but submitted a query to the Attorney General of the Philippine Islands. The Secretary of Justice, or the Attorney General out there, being a Filipino, very promptly rendered a decision that the 18th Amendment did not apply to the Philippine Islands, and Governor General Harrison has refused to interest himself in the execution of the law. As you can see the quote on screen as well. So Randall was undoubtedly an avowed supporter of the 18th Amendment, being the only candidate from the Prohibition Party ever to an election to Congress. However, during the course of Randall's testimony, it became evident that his support for extending prohibition was due primarily to concern over conditions among US soldiers stationed in the Philippines, rather than anxiety over Filipino consumption of alcohol. Randall claimed that the availability of alcohol in the Philippines had a detrimental effect on the approximately 23,000 US servicemen in the colony, as well as the indigenous population. He primarily attributed the state of affairs to the presence of unscrupulous Americans in the Philippines, asserting that vast numbers of vice promoters, liquor people, and gamblers from the United States are located in the city of Manila, and they are exploiting the people there, particularly Americans. He concluded that, following consultation with Army officers stationed there, I am asking for the enforcement of this law in the Philippine Islands more in the interest of our own people there than the Filipinos themselves. The Committee on the Judiciary was unmoved by Randall's argument, responding that, in contrast to other US territories such as Hawaii, Filipinos themselves had not voted for prohibition. Randall insisted that inhabitants of the Philippines had taken action in the form of a mass meeting held in Manila to ask Congress to apply the Volstead Act to the Philippine Islands. Representative Leonidas Dyer concluded tersely that the Philippine legislature had not passed a statute enforcing the Volstead Act, and, in his words, if the Filipinos want to vote for prohibition, that is their business. So I can include the whole hearing transcript here, obviously, for time constraints, but it is actually really entertaining to read if you're ever interested in learning more about that. While Randall's claim that the people of the Philippine Islands had, in effect, en masse demanded prohibition was far from accurate, he was not entirely wrong in citing the existence of Filipino support for the measure. A little-known example of advocacy for prohibition is the work of Filipino Methodist missionary Leo de Garia Sipao, who is second from the right here, as a temperance activist in the Philippines during the early 20th century, as attested to by the report on the Anti-Saloon League's convention held in Toronto in 1922. Following the ratification of prohibition in the US, the Anti-Saloon League campaigned as the World League Against Alcoholism for the adoption of temperance and eventual prohibition legislation in other countries. The League's report on the Toronto Convention noted disapprovingly that the Philippines are the only territory under the American flag to which the prohibition law of the United States does not apply, and claimed as a result, the liquor traffic has grown there faster than it ever did in the United States. This assertion was backed by the reported statistic of a more than triple increase of 25,969 saloons in 1910 compared to 86,941 in 1918. However, the League's report found a cause for optimism in Sipao's prediction of a dry society in the Philippines. Ms. Leo de Garia Sipao of the Philippines was the fourth delegate with a prophecy definite in terms of time. She is sure that the islands will be dry in the course of 5 years. Despite the seemingly daunting growth of saloons in the last decade, the temperance workers who have organized throughout the islands are confident, and Ms. Sapal bases her prediction on the hold that the new education is taking on the people. Sapal's optimism proved unfounded. Not only was prohibition never enforced there, by 1930, the Philippines were cited as an argument for repealing the 18th Amendment in the United States. As you can see on this new slide here, you can see the organization, the Crusaders, was one of the many groups in the US that were advocating for a repeal of the 18th Amendment at this point. Pierre S. DuPont, representing the Association Against the Prohibition Amendment, another similar anti-prohibition movement, testified before Congress that on 5 occasions, at least, the Congress has felt seemingly obliged to disregard the Constitution, including permitting the sale of intoxicating liquors in the Philippines. These things show the embarrassment of Congress under this unyielding amendment. Moreover, congressional testimony from soldiers formerly stationed in the Philippines contradicted the assertions of prohibitionists like Hiram Randall. General Clarence R. Edwards stated, "When we first went to the Philippines, the first thing the men got hold of was that old Beano," referring to Beano. "I think that was the name of it, and it would drive them crazy, but we only had a few cases of that." In response to Representative Emmanuel Seller's question of, "Do you find the soldiers are any worse in the Philippines?" General Edwards clarified, "Every officer I have seen said they are perfectly delighted that there are no restrictions in the Philippines. I question the discipline, as they are all having their beer, although they cannot have canteens in the immediate garrison."
Sorry to interrupt, this is your 2-minute warning.
Thank you. "I do not know by my own first knowledge, but everyone tells me there is no intemperance among the troops there." Finally, in 1933, the 18th Amendment was officially repealed, the only constitutional amendment in the United States to no longer apply. And so just to wrap up here, indigenous traditions of alcohol production and consumption in the Philippines long predated American arrival. However, during the United States colonial era of the Philippines, American officials frequently conceptualized Filipino cultures of alcohol consumption as moderate in nature. Hearings for the Jones Act demonstrate that these colonial perceptions of Filipino sobriety formed part of the evaluation of proceeding with greater political autonomy for the Philippines. This autonomy was later acknowledged by legislation enforcing prohibition in the United States itself, leaving the option of banning alcohol to the popularly elected Philippine legislature. Prohibitionists' later attempts to extend the Volstead Act to the Philippines was mainly centered on purported concern for US soldiers stationed there and their unsanctioned access to alcohol, rather than anxiety over Filipino consumption. The failure of these efforts, largely due to the colonial state effectively declining to enforce the 18th Amendment in the Philippines, illustrates the tangible impact of colonial perceptions of Filipino culture on enforcement of colonial regulation of alcohol. Thank you.